The student received a difficult assignment, and his solution shocked the professor. Hello friends, today I will tell you a relatively short story about a young man which occurred many years ago. Even though the story contains nothing supernatural, I'm not exaggerating when I say it was able to change the lives of millions across the world. In one way or another, every self-respecting, successful person knows about it, and I think each one of you should hear it as well. It began in the distant 1914 when a baby named George was born into a family of Jewish immigrants in Portland, Oregon. His dad was a math teacher, and his mom was a linguist in the library. I won't speak about George's early childhood because it contained nothing extraordinary. He grew up like a typical boy of those days and didn't stand out from his peers. The only thing that his dad literally forced on him was to study geometry. It's probably inaccurate to say that the boy was thrilled by this, but he obeyed his dad. At first, he solved simple problems that his dad gave him. But by the time he was ready to graduate high school, he was solving pretty difficult ones. Be that as he may, he was definitely not a genius. He was relatively well-versed in mathematical science, which ultimately got him accepted into the University of Maryland to the Faculty of Mathematics. But he was a regular student and was no different from the hundreds or even thousands of others like him. What's more is that George would often allow himself to skip class, which resulted in him being punished with extra homework. By the way, at this point, we've approached our central point, one that can change your worldview. So imagine the following scenario in the University of California in Berkeley in 1939. 25-year-old student named George is running down one of the university's long hallways for unknown reasons, as it's happened many times before. He was late to Professor Jerzy Neyman's statistics class. What's more is that he was a whole 20 minutes late. Having caught his breath only a little bit prior to entering the auditorium, he quietly opened the door and entered. The young man wanted to be unnoticed, so he sat down at a desk quickly. Afterwards, he started looking around, trying to figure out what he missed. But when he noticed his professor's face, he realized that it was not the best time to draw attention to himself. By the time he showed up in the auditorium, the conditions of 2 math problems were written on the blackboard. George thought it was the next homework assignment for the next class, so the irresponsible student simply copied the problems in his notebook and started listening to the professor while thinking about his own things. But friends, soon after returning home from class, he deeply regretted being late to that class. The problems were very hard, and the young man thought he likely missed something important at the beginning of the class, which would have helped him solve the problems. But there was nothing left to do, and he had a serious struggle for a couple of days in order to solve the problems and complete the assignment by the next statistics class. I'll get ahead of myself to say that things turned out to be a lot simpler and a lot more complicated at the same time. A few days later, the happy student went to see the professor to hand in his notebook and the completed assignment. The professor took the notebook absent-mindedly, without turning his eyes away from the blackboard, on which he was drawing graphs for the next class. He said, "Okay, thank you." Of course, he didn't immediately remember that he didn't assign his students anything of the sort, and simply put the notebook on top of his desk to check later. 2 weeks passed, and George still didn't get an answer from the professor. What's more is that in the following class, the professor went up to George and said that his assignment was still being checked. This made the young man even more nervous because such a long checking process could end badly for him, especially since the midterm grades would come out soon. But what happened next is hard to fathom. After some time, George was asked into the dean's office. He had a bad feeling about this, and when he opened the door, he saw that in addition to the dean, a number of men that he didn't know and his statistics professor were waiting in the office. It's hard to explain what the student was feeling at the time, and maybe he was preparing for the worst. But what his professor said surprised him. "Congratulations, George. Did you come up with it? Did you do it by yourself or did someone help you?" The young man didn't understand what was going on. So he asked his professor, "What are you talking about?" After that, Jerzy Neyman showed him his notebook with the homework. It turns out that he solved everything correctly, only it wasn't a homework assignment. When the professor finally found time to look at the notebook that the student brought him, he couldn't believe his eyes. He remembered that at the beginning of one of his lectures, he really did show his students the conditions of those 2 problems. However, those 2 conditions were of 2 unsolved problems. The problems were a mystery that, at the time, not only the professor, but also the rest of the great minds in the whole world could not solve for decades. The most outstanding mathematicians tried to solve them, and even the most venerable scientists simply struggled. However, George simply didn't know that they were unsolvable because of a stupid turn of events. He didn't hear the part of the lecture where the professor said that nobody in the whole world was able to solve them. That's how, after struggling for only a few days, George was able to solve that professors from the Mathematical Academy of Sciences came to the dean's office to congratulate the student. Our hero's full name is George Bernard Dantzig, a famous scientist of the 20th century who developed the algorithm to solve problems by the simplex method. He's also considered the founder of linear programming and became the first recipient of the von Neumann Theory Prize in 1974. Later, our student received the National Medal of Science and an honorary doctorate from the University of Maryland. In the 1970s, he became a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He authored many papers and books. All this would have likely not happened, and his name would not have been so widely known had he come to class on time. At least that's what Professor George Dantzig himself used to say with a smile. Sometimes you're capable of doing the impossible, something that seems completely unrealistic, something that nobody else has done before you. All this is possible only if you yourself do not convince yourself that it's impossible. When asked how he was able to achieve all that, George Dantzig said that he'd come to the lecture on time and heard those problems were unsolvable. He would have obviously never been able to solve them. This story is a lesson to the most daring and successful people, innovators of our time, billionaires and pioneers. All of them are convinced that all our problems are only in our heads and our perception of what we're doing. Friends, what do you think? Is that really so the whole problem? Simply us not believing that this is realistic? Definitely write your opinions and personal thoughts in the comments. That's all for today. Rate the video if you liked it, and we'll see you soon.